Okay, so have you ever been in one of those conversations?
Oh, you mean the kind where you feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall?
Yeah, you've got the facts, the logic, everything neatly lined up, but the other person, nope, not moving an inch. It's like,
Mhm.
are we even speaking the same language here?
Totally. That frustration of trying to change someone's mind and getting absolutely nowhere, it's universal.
It makes you wonder, like, can minds really change? Or are we all just stuck in our own little thought bubbles?
Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today. The science of how minds change, or, sometimes how they just stubbornly refuse to.
Right. We're going deep on this, and our main guide is this book by David McRaney, How Minds Change.
Which I gotta say feels super relevant right now of like everything's so polarized, all these strong opinions flying around.
Yeah, it's intense out there. And McRaney himself, he's the author. He actually admits in the book that after years of studying this stuff, cognitive biases and all that, he started to get pretty pessimistic.
About our ability to actually change each other's minds, yeah.
And that's a feeling I think a lot of us can relate to, right? You try to have a reasonable conversation, present your evidence, but it's like talking to a wall.
Oh, absolutely. It's like,
Wow.
what's the point?
But then, you see these examples in history and society where minds do change. And sometimes it happens really fast. Like, remember the whole shift in public opinion on same-sex marriage?
Oh, yeah, in the US especially. I mean, the speed of that change was wild.
Between 2012 and 2013, it went from, like, a major debate to widespread acceptance. And it makes you wonder, what happened there?
Right. If minds can change that quickly on something so big and so like culturally charged.
Then why does it feel so impossible in our everyday lives,
Yeah.
to convince someone about something maybe much smaller?
That's the mystery we're trying to untangle, right? How does change happen? And are there better ways to approach it than just throwing facts at people?
So McRaney kicks off the book with this story about his own experience as a TV meteorologist. And, climate change was becoming a big issue, obviously.
And he's like reporting on the science, sharing the consensus from experts, all that. You'd think that would be enough.
But he starts getting all this backlash online. People accusing him of being part of some conspiracy, totally dismissing the science.
Which totally illustrates why that, what's it called? The information deficit model.
Yeah, the idea that people just need more information and then they'll change their minds, it just doesn't work that way.
Not in the real world, no. Because McRaney realized, like, his viewers weren't necessarily uninformed. They had their own set of information, even if it wasn't, scientifically accurate.
It's like they were actively seeking out information that confirmed what they already believed, even if it wasn't, the most reliable information.
And then he brings up this really interesting case, Charlie Veitch, who was a big 9/11 truther, but he actually changed his mind.
What? Really? A 9/11 truther changed his mind. How did that happen?
Well, he went to New York himself, like did his own investigation, talked to experts, looked at the structural reports, all that.
Yeah. So he, went straight to the source, got the information firsthand.
Exactly. And for him, that was enough. He was like, okay, I was wrong.
But here's the thing, right? When he tried to share what he'd learned with his, truther buddies,
Oh, they flipped out.
they basically, kicked him out of the club, accused him of being a sellout, part of the conspiracy, all that.
It shows how much our beliefs are tied up with our social identity. Like changing your mind can mean losing your community.
So that's the question, isn't it? Why did the facts convince Charlie, but not the people he'd been hanging out with? What was the difference there?
Right. It can't just be about the information itself. There's something else going on.
So to try and figure this out, McRaney dives into this approach called deep canvassing, which is being used by the Leadership Lab at the Los Angeles LGBT Center.
And they've been having some pretty remarkable success in shifting people's opinions on like really sensitive social issues. And what's interesting is it's not about bombarding people with facts and figures.
Yeah, it's almost the opposite, right? They focus on listening, on getting people to share their own stories and experiences.
McRaney describes it as a layer cake. You start with a thin layer of building rapport, then a bit of our story, like the canvasser's perspective. But the biggest layer, that's all about their story.
The person they're
Yeah.
talking to, yeah. So it's about creating a space where people feel safe to, process their own thoughts and feelings.
And the idea is that people are more likely to change their own minds if they're guided to sort of, talk it through themselves.
It's like you're not telling them what to think, you're helping them figure out what they think.
Exactly. And McRaney tells this great story about this guy, they call him Mustang Man, who was initially against same-sex marriage. But after a deep canvassing conversation, he actually changed his position.
Wow, really? What shifted his perspective?
It wasn't about the legal arguments or anything like that. It was about connecting on a human level, exploring his own values, and how those values actually aligned with supporting same-sex marriage.
So it's about finding those personal touch points, those real-life experiences that resonate with people.
And often, that involves tapping into emotions. McRaney talks about this woman, Martha, who watched a video about an unplanned pregnancy during a deep canvassing session.
Okay, so what was her reaction?
Well, she initially kind of held her ground, but then the conversation shifted to her own life, and it turned out she knew someone who'd had a really bad, unsafe abortion.
Oh, wow.
And it was that connection, that emotional weight, that seemed to really make an impact.
So it's not just about logic, it's about those deeper emotional layers of belief.
Now, it's important to mention that there was a big controversy around some of the initial research on deep canvassing.
Oh yeah, the studies that seem to show these huge, long-lasting effects, but then it turned out,
Some of that data was, well, made up.
oof, yeah, that was a major bummer. It kind of threw a wrench into the whole idea that deep canvassing was this, like, magic bullet for changing minds.
It definitely made people more cautious, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
But, even with that retraction, the work that the leadership LMA is doing is still really interesting.
Yeah, it shows that there's something to this approach. And McRaney brings up this concept called belief change blindness, which I think is fascinating.
Belief change blindness.
Yeah, it's the idea that sometimes people's opinions shift without them even realizing it. McRaney talks about a study where students read these essays about spanking, and afterwards, their views on spanking had changed, but a lot of them didn't even notice.
So it's like their minds changed on a subconscious level.
Right, and that suggests that belief change isn't always this conscious, deliberate thing. Sometimes it happens beneath the surface.
Which, makes it even harder to study and understand.
Okay, so we've talked about facts, emotions, all that, but let's get into the nitty-gritty of how our brains actually process belief. McRaney uses this great example, the dress. Remember that?
Oh, the black and blue, or was it white and gold?
Yeah. That picture that drove the internet crazy. People were so sure they were seeing it correctly, and they couldn't understand how anyone could see it differently.
It was like a fundamental rift in reality.
And what McRaney explains is that our brains don't just passively record the world around us. They actively construct our own subjective reality.
Well, our brains are constantly building these internal models of how things work.
Exactly. And he mentions this biologist, Jakob Johann von Uexküll, who talked about how different creatures experience the world in completely different ways.
Like a dog's whelps, their sensory world is totally different from a bat's or a fish's.
And even for us humans, our perception is limited by our senses and how our brains interpret that sensory data. He gives the example of patients who get cataract surgery.
Oh, right, because even after the surgery, when their vision is physically restored.
And they don't just suddenly see clearly.
Yeah.
Their brains have to, relearn how to process those visual signals.
It takes time to build up that three-dimensional understanding.
So our brains are constantly working to make sense of everything, filling in the gaps, making assumptions.
And that leads us to this slightly complicated model, the SRFP model.
SRFP.
It stands for Subjective Uncertainty Reduction Forcing a Prediction About Disambiguation.
Okay, I'm not even going to try to repeat that. But what does it basically mean?
It's about how our brains handle uncertainty. They basically make these unconscious predictions based on our past experiences and what we're motivated to see.
So our brain's like, okay, I've seen something like this before, and I'm really hoping it's this thing, so I'm going to assume it has that thing.
Exactly. And because this process is so unconscious, we don't even realize we're doing it. So the interpretation our brain comes up with, like seeing the dress as black and blue.
It feels like an objective truth.
Right. And that's why we can have these really strong disagreements even when we're looking at the same information, because our brains are unconsciously filling in different blanks.
And that leads to what McRaney calls frame contests.
Where people might agree on the basic facts, but they interpret them completely differently.
Like, two people might agree that crime has increased, but they have totally different ideas about why it's happening.
And the SRPV model helps explain why these frame contests can be so hard to resolve. Because it's like we're arguing about different realities.
Okay, so our brains are building these internal models, filling in gaps, interpreting things based on our past experiences. But how do we even decide what's true in the first place?
That's where epistemology comes in.
Epistemology.
It's basically the study of knowledge. Like, how do we know what we know? What counts as evidence? What makes something true?
Okay, so it's about the foundations of knowledge.
Right. And McRaney talks about two main types of knowledge. Declarative knowledge, which is knowing that something is true, like the sky is blue, and procedural knowledge, which is knowing how to do something, like ride a bike.
Got it. So declarative's about facts and procedural's about skills.
Exactly. And traditionally, we've tested knowledge claims through propositions, like statements that can be true or false. But McRaney points out that evidence alone isn't enough. We also need conditions.
Conditions, what does that mean?
Conditions are like the rules or criteria we use to define what makes something true, and also what makes it false. So, for example, if you're defining a triangle, it's not just a shape. It has to have three sides and three angles. Those are the conditions.
Okay, so it's like the specific criteria that something has to meet to be considered true.
And having these shared conditions is what allows us to build upon basic ideas to understand more complex things. McRaney gives this interesting historical example of the belief that barnacle geese grew on trees.
Wait, what? Barnacle geese growing on trees?
Yeah, it sounds crazy now, but back then people hadn't actually observed barnacle geese laying eggs, and they'd find these barnacle-covered objects on driftwood. So they figured those must be baby geese, and they must grow on trees.
So it was a logical conclusion based on the information they had at the time.
Right. And this belief persisted for centuries because it didn't really affect their daily lives. Plus, they trusted the authorities who, drew pictures of these goose trees in their books.
It's like if something doesn't directly contradict your experience and it's endorsed by people you trust, you might not question it too deeply.
Which brings us to another interesting experiment, the Brunner and Postman card experiment.
What did they do in that one?
They showed people playing cards, but some of the cards were weird, like a black four of hearts.
Okay, so cards that broke the rules.
Right. And at first, people would try to fit these weird cards into their existing mental models of how cards work. They'd misidentify them or get confused.
But then, as they saw more and more of these anomalous cards,
They'd have this perceptual crisis, like their whole understanding of playing cards started to break down.
and eventually they'd have this shock of recognition where they realized, okay, some of these cards are just different. I need to update my model.
It shows how we initially resist information that doesn't fit our worldview, but when we encounter enough conflicting evidence, we can have this big shift in our understanding.
So sometimes it's like a sudden breakthrough, and sometimes it's more gradual. McRaney talks about Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts in science where whole ways of thinking get replaced.
But then Piaget had this view of mind change as more of an ongoing process of integrating new information into existing structures.
So like constantly updating our mental software.
Exactly. And McRaney also discusses how traumatic events can lead to rapid belief change through something called post-traumatic growth.
Right, because after a trauma, our basic assumptions about the world can be shattered.
Yeah.
And then we have to rebuild our understanding.
And often that rebuilding process involves adopting new beliefs that can be surprisingly resistant to change.
Okay, so trauma can be a catalyst for change. And then there's cognitive dissonance.
That uncomfortable feeling we get when our beliefs and actions don't match up.
And McRaney talks about people with anosognosia who have brain injuries that make them unaware of their own deficits.
And the interesting thing is, they don't seem to experience cognitive dissonance.
So even when they're presented with evidence that they can't do something, they don't adjust their beliefs.
It shows how important that feeling of dissonance is for actually motivating us to change our minds.
And McRaney also discusses this research on the effective tipping point.
The effective tipping point.
Yeah, it's this idea that when we encounter information that challenges our beliefs, at first we try to assimilate it, fit it into our existing model. And that can actually strengthen our original beliefs.
Like we're digging our heels in.
But there's a point where we can't ignore the inconsistencies anymore. And that's the effective tipping point.
And then our brains switch from trying to defend our old beliefs to actively learning and updating.
So there's this threshold of discomfort that can actually push us towards change.
Okay, so we've explored the limits of facts, the power of emotions, all the brain stuff. But let's not forget the social side of belief.
Right, because our beliefs are also shaped by the people around us. And McRaney uses the example of Zach Phelps-Roper leaving the Westboro Baptist Church.
Oh, wow, yeah. He grew up in that incredibly, closed-off community with those extreme beliefs.
And as he said himself, he didn't change his opinions to leave the church. He changed his opinions because he left.
It was like stepping outside that bubble allowed him to see things differently.
And his sister, Megan, also left Westboro. but through a different path.
She started engaging with people on Twitter, people who challenged her beliefs. And it was those conversations, those consistent, respectful interactions that eventually led her to question everything she'd been taught.
It's like those little cracks in her certainty just kept getting wider and wider.
And it shows the power of engaging with different viewpoints, even if it's uncomfortable.
And this ties into the whole idea of tribal psychology, right?
That we're social creatures and we have this deep need to belong.
And often, that need to belong can be stronger than our desire to be right.
McRaney talks about these experiments called the minimal group paradigm, where they divide people into groups based on totally random things, like a coin flip.
And even in those situations, people start favoring their own group.
It shows how easily we fall into this us versus them mentality.
And in groups like, say, conspiracy theory communities, that fear of being ostracized can be really powerful.
People will cling to the group's beliefs, even when those beliefs are contradicted by evidence, because they're afraid of being alone.
It's a reminder that belonging is a basic human need.
And going back to Charlie Veitch, the 9/11 truther, McRaney suggests that maybe his shift away from those beliefs was partly because he joined a new tribe.
Oh, you mean the BBC documentary team he was working with?
Right. Maybe those new social connections influenced how he processed information.
It's like who we surround ourselves with shapes how we see the world.
And McRaney also mentions research showing that self-affirmation can make people more open to different viewpoints.
Self-affirmation, like reminding yourself of your positive qualities.
Yeah, it's like when you feel secure in yourself, you're less threatened by opposing ideas.
And there's this idea from Tom Stafford that truth is social.
Like, truth isn't just about objective facts, it's about how we arrive at those facts through social interaction.
And that's why echo chambers can be so dangerous, because they limit the range of perspectives we're exposed to.
They shut down that healthy back and forth that helps us refine our thinking.
Okay, so changing minds is hard. But are there any strategies that actually work?
Well, McRaney dives into a bunch of them. He talks about the elaboration likelihood model, or ELM, which describes two main paths to persuasion: the central route and the peripheral route.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the central route is about really engaging with the arguments, the evidence, all that. And if you convince someone through the central route, that change is more likely to last.
But it also takes more effort, right?
Definitely. Then there's the peripheral route, which relies on things like the speaker's attractiveness or emotional appeals.
So it's more about persuasion through, like, superficial cues.
And changes that happen through the peripheral route tend to be less stable.
Okay, so central route is deep, peripheral route is surface level.
Exactly. And then McRaney talks about street epistemology.
Street epistemology, what's that?
It's a technique for, gently guiding people to examine how they arrived at their beliefs.
So instead of directly challenging their beliefs, you focus on their reasoning process.
Right. And it involves things like establishing rapport, asking them to state their belief, clarifying definitions, and then really digging into their reasons.
Like, how did they come to that conclusion?
Exactly. And then you explore the reliability of their methods. You might ask, would you still hold this belief if you'd arrived at it through a less reliable method?
So it's about getting them to think critically about how they form their beliefs.
And the goal isn't to win an argument, it's to help them become better thinkers.
It's like improving their mental toolkit.
And McRaney also introduces Corinne Tamarius's Smart Politics, which draws on techniques from motivational interviewing.
Oh, interesting. How does that work?
It's about helping people explore their own ambivalence about an issue. You ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to change your mind?
And then you get them talking about why they're not at a 1 or a 10.
Right. And you reflect their reasoning back to them so they feel heard and understood.
So both street epistemology and smart politics are about, facilitating self-discovery rather than dictating what people should think.
And McRaney talks about the difference between topic rebuttal and technique rebuttal.
Okay, I'm guessing topic rebuttal is what we usually do, right? Arguing against some of the specific points.
Exactly. But technique rebuttal is about focusing on the flaws in their reasoning.
So it's less about the what and more about the how.
Right. And that can be more effective for really entrenched beliefs because you're addressing the underlying foundation of their thinking.
And McRaney brings up this idea from Robert Burton that certainty is an emotion, not a conclusion.
Which I think is so profound because it means that even when we feel absolutely certain about something, that feeling might not be based on logic.
It's more like a gut feeling that we've dressed up as a rational thought.
Which is why simply presenting facts often doesn't work, because you're not addressing that deeper emotional layer.
Okay, so to recap, we've got street epistemology for examining factual claims, deep canvassing for shifting attitudes, smart politics for navigating values, and motivational interviewing for influencing behaviors.
Quite a toolkit.
And McRaney shares a story about using street epistemology with a guy named Jathan Reichel who believed in God.
Oh, yeah, and it led to this really deep conversation about the reasons behind Jathan's belief, his personal experiences, all that.
It shows that even beliefs that seem like abstract or theological can be rooted in very real, very human experiences.
Okay, so we've talked about changing individual minds, but what about large-scale social change?
How do those big shifts happen?
McRaney discusses the concept of social cascades.
Social cascade.
It's about how ideas and behaviors spread through a population. Like you have a small group of innovators, then early adopters, and then it gradually reaches the mainstream.
So it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. And the key is often influencing those early adopters, the people who are well-connected and influential.
Because they can then spread the idea to their networks.
Right. And trust is huge here, especially in what McRaney calls a post-trust world, where people are skeptical of institutions and authorities.
Like we've seen that with vaccine hesitancy. People distrust the government, the medical establishment, so they're less likely to accept the information about vaccines.
Exactly. And then there are conformity thresholds.
Conformity thresholds.
It's the amount of influence someone needs to be exposed to before they adopt a new belief or behavior. And these thresholds vary from person to person.
So some people are easily swayed, and others are more resistant.
Right. McRaney uses the example of people leaving a party. Like, once a few people start to leave, it becomes more acceptable for others to leave too.
So it's like a snowball effect.
And this relates to the idea of percolating vulnerable clusters.
Percolating vulnerable clusters.
These are groups that are tightly connected internally, but also have some weak ties to other groups. And they often have a mix of people with different conformity thresholds.
So they're like these little pockets within the larger network that can be more receptive to new ideas.
And if you can influence those clusters, the idea can then spread outwards through their weaker ties.
Okay, so it's about finding those key groups that can act as bridges to broader change.
And finally, McRaney circles back to, like, the ultimate challenge, flat earthers.
Oh yeah, that's a tough one.
But McRaney makes the point that flat earthers and people who hold other, unconventional beliefs, they're often intelligent people.
They're not just like dumb or crazy.
Right. They're driven by the same psychological needs as everyone else. The need for a compelling narrative, a sense of belonging.
And for some people, flat earth theory provides that. It's this big, overarching explanation for how the world works.
And it plays into distrust of authority, the feeling that we're being lied to.
And of course, there's confirmation bias. Once you start believing something, you tend to seek out information that confirms it.
And we're social creatures, right? So we talk to people who share our beliefs, and that reinforces those beliefs.
It's like we're constantly building these echo chambers around ourselves.
McRaney talks about his own interaction with a flat earther and how difficult it was to even have a productive conversation.
It shows how deeply entrenched these beliefs can be.
So the big takeaway from all this is that changing minds is messy and complicated. It's not just about logic and evidence. We have to understand the psychology, the social dynamics, the emotions involved.
It's about seeing the whole person, not just their beliefs.
And I think that's a good reminder for all of us, to be more curious about why people believe what they believe, even if we disagree with them.
And maybe by understanding those deeper motivations, we can find more effective ways to connect and communicate.
Because ultimately, that's what it's all about, right? Building bridges, even when it's hard.
And on that note, here's something to think about. Given how personal and socially ingrained our beliefs are, what's our responsibility to try and understand the why behind viewpoints that differ from our own, even when those viewpoints seem wrong or even upsetting? It's a tough question, but I think it's worth asking ourselves.
I agree. It's a conversation we need to keep having.